by the time of recording, Man United and Borussia Dortmund still hushing out the finer details of the deal. The only thing that seems to hold us up, and I'm coming to you here first, Matt, because I personally think this is hilarious, but Manchester United wants to make the deal look good for them publicly. I think there's no way in the world that Manchester United are going to look good coming out of this deal publicly right now. I mean, they might at the end if Jadon Sancho does well at Dortmund, does return to Man United and looks like the player he was, 2 years ago now, right? But there will be one day, I think, a book written about what went wrong for Jadon Sancho at Manchester United. But ultimately, it did go wrong. And I know you are a Man United supporter. This is your English club. You're close to the club. You understand the club. What do you think went wrong here?
Like you said, given that the reason why, as we speak, the deal is still being held up, given that is down to Manchester United, looking to score some sort of communicative PR points out of the whole situation. I think that tells at least half of the story. Jadon Sancho, I think, to a great extent, has himself to blame. We'll come on to that. But I think there's a massive caveat involved here in that Jadon Sancho is not the only player who has struggled to make an impact at Manchester United in the last 10, 12 years. He joins a long list where he's returning to the Bundesliga at the same time as Donny van de Beek. You could arguably put him in that bracket as well. Sancho arrived at United at one of several strange periods over the past 10 years under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. And I think, looking back, that's probably where one of the first problems arose, in that as a young player who had benefited so well from being in that sort of Bundesliga ecosystem, I think the move probably came at the wrong time. Being at Dortmund at the time he was, I think particularly under Lucien Favre, even though he didn't have the greatest relationship with Favre, he was nevertheless at a club and in a league which is quite keen and focused on its tactical development. I think sometimes to its own detriment, in that you end up with a lot of clubs, a lot of teams playing effectively the same way. Nevertheless, a lot of Bundesliga clubs do place a greater focus on much better planned attacking patterns, transitional play, trained automatisms on the training ground, and I think that benefited Jadon Sancho greatly. He was then taken out of that environment and placed in an environment in Manchester under a coach who, similarly lacked the pedigree. We were talking about Edin Terzic earlier. I think there are probably certain similarities there to the environment that Sancho then found in Manchester with under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, where the football was very one-dimensional. It was purely based on counter-attacks, at least against the top teams, and there didn't seem to be much more of an offensive plan beyond that. So I don't think that was helpful for a young player like Jadon Sancho. What also didn't help him was him arriving in the same summer as the surprise return of Cristiano Ronaldo, particularly as Sancho had been earmarked largely for the right wing. That was then obviously taken by Ronaldo, and even though I always thought Sancho was at his most dangerous on the left-hand side for Dortmund, cutting in onto his right foot the way he used to do. At least at the time, that position at United was generally filled by Marcus Rashford, who similarly enjoyed cutting his head onto his right foot, albeit in a more direct and penetrative way than perhaps Jadon Sancho's dribbles. It all got off to a pretty unfortunate start on several levels. Add to that the consistent changes of coach. Ralf Rangnick actually spoke quite highly of Sancho during his short tenure in interim charge of United. Maybe that's not surprising, given that so many Bundesliga clubs, including Borussia Dortmund, whether they like it or not, have ended up playing a similar style of football to the one which Ralf Rangnick, arguably to a great extent, introduced to German football. So maybe it's no surprise that Ranić was a particularly fan of Jadon Sancho's, at least his potential talents. Nevertheless, like I said, despite all the caveats, Jadon Sancho has also not helped himself, has he? Which, I'm sure you two will have noticed that as well.
Yeah, I mean, Stefan, I think you'd probably have a lot of thoughts, but like obviously, I think that it takes two to fight. I do think that given Manchester United's track record with a lot of other signings, there is this might be more on the club than the player, but you know, Sancho also didn't help himself with his social media antics. That is something I think that he needs to work on. I think too, there was also reports that he didn't show up for practice on time. You know, I don't know how much there is to that story. I think the one thing that I always think, if it's one player who doesn't work out, that's fine. But if you on a consistent basis manage to sign players and they're getting worse at your club, then it's usually the club's fault. I mean, we have lots of examples like that in Germany, right? Hamburger SV, for example, were notorious for signing players that gotten worse there. And that usually comes down to the club and the philosophy of the club. So I think there is something generally wrong. The one thing that I have, and maybe let's move this conversation towards what this means for Borussia Dortmund. I learned a long time ago that you shouldn't go back. What's done is done. You know, and I worry about players coming back, and Dortmund have done this many times, whether it's Shinji Kagawa, Nuri Sahin, just to mention two, right? That did come back, and it wasn't the same as it was before, simply because the clubs change and teams change, and the environment at the team, within the team, changes as well. And I also think that this on a short-term loan deal is something that I am not sure there's enough time to fix Jadon Sancho from here to June. Obviously, if this deal includes some sort of, you know, open door to negotiate a transfer, and it seems that's the case. There is no option to buy. At least that's what the latest is on this. Maybe this will also change, but at the moment it doesn't seem to be an option to buy. So Dortmund have no control over the asset, which is, I think, is always something that you don't want, because if you only have this player for 6 months and then it's gone again, and you know, this is, in my opinion, fixing Jadon Sancho is not a short-term project. It's a medium or even long-term project. You need to integrate the player. You need to get the player up and running quickly, because Borussia Dortmund are currently 5th in the Bundesliga, which I know, yes, right now that's a Champions League spot, but we don't know if that's still the case come the end of the season. We don't know how the Bundesliga will perform in Europe, so that's precarious at the least. And so I just think that bringing back a player without having control over him is a very, very risky thing to do. And even if Jadon Sancho hits the ground running and scores lots of goals and assists, then he's also gone again, because Man United will say, oh, okay, great, thanks, you fixed him. We're going to put him back in our squad, or we're just going to sell him for lots of money to another club. So, Stefan, these are the issues I have with this deal, and I think that's probably some of your thoughts overlap with this.
Yeah, it's an interesting move. I mean, I completely agree with you in the sense that I'm a little baffled as to what Dortmund get out of this in the long run. If, you know, they can't agree some sort of deal for a long-term move. And I mean, look, we have to bear in mind as well the fact that Sancho is on so much money at Manchester United that, you know, there's every chance that Man United would be happy to sell him. And I mean, as Matt would probably be able to tell us, there's been quite a lot of reports in England since, you know, Eunice, I never pronounce the name properly. I don't know why. Eunice, is it Eunice or Ianias? Ineos, yeah, I don't know why. It's pronounced like some Greek warrior or something. So a lot of reports that they are even willing to go to such an extent that they'd be willing to kind of, you know, almost just kind of write off players' contracts and just let them leave for good. If it meant they got, you know, bad attitudes or players who aren't really willing to kind of all fight for the cause. If they can get those players out of the dressing room, then they'd be willing to kind of take a short-term hit on that financially. So you can understand the situation where maybe Man United would be more than willing to discuss the prospect of selling Sancho, but Dortmund simply can't afford him, either in terms of a transfer fee or wages. We don't really know the finer details there as to whether it's Man United not being willing to sell him or Dortmund just accepting that they would never be able to afford him in the first place. Because I know, for example, they're also chasing Ian Maatsen, the left back at Chelsea, and I think in that regard there is an obligation to buy, or at least an offer, or a clause there, because obviously Chelsea are trying to move players on, and Dortmund probably see a young player that they can probably turn around. But that doesn't really help. That's the why as to why there might not be a kind of a sell-on fee, but it doesn't really explain the how. And in that regard, I mean, the fact that, as you said, maybe he does turn things around to Dortmund, which is still a big if, because we can talk about that in a minute. But I don't exactly think there's a red carpet rolled out for him to walk straight into Eden Terzic's first team. Maybe there is, but it's not really what I think is the case. And even if he can do that, and even if he can kind of get his form back on track, there's every chance that Man United will have a new head coach next season. And this new head coach may have every intention of bringing Jadon Sancho back into the fold at Man United. So it's a short-term solution to a problem, and I'm not entirely sure it is a proper solution to it, to be perfectly honest with you, because it's a huge if to see if Sancho, after 2 years of really plateauing at Man United and more or less not even training properly, not playing properly. We don't know what his fitness levels are like as he approaches this move to Dortmund. So it's a huge if as to whether he can even hit the ground running and begin to look like even half the player he was before he left for Manchester United. But all of that would have been willing to stomach if there was some sort of long-term plan for him to return to the club, and be a long-term solution there. But
I think any of the doubts and the ifs that are being mentioned, I think they're only problems if there is any assumption that there is any long-term plan at all. And given that I don't think there is, I don't see it as a problem at all. I don't think anybody at Borussia Dortmund thinks they can fix Jadon Sancho. I don't even think that's the aim. I don't think anyone at Borussia Dortmund has any intention of signing Jadon Sancho long-term. They simply can't afford him. And Sancho...
So why bring him back at all?
Well, because he's got nowhere else to go, and secondly, he's effectively there on a free. They're paying, was it €3 million as a loan fee, and Manchester United are continuing to pay the lion's share of his wages. Dortmund are desperate for anything to enliven their attacking play, given that start to the season. Whether Jadon Sancho can do that or not, I don't know. It remains to be seen. It probably is quite unlikely, given that he's not trained. He's not even trained with the first team. He's not even trained with the under-21s in recent months. But Borussia Dortmund aren't losing anything. He's not a long-term solution. We discussed before what the long-term is for Borussia Dortmund. That's still very much in the stars. They have bigger issues to sort out long-term than Jadon Sancho, and that revolves around Veth, around Terzic, around Cahill. I think it's a no-lose situation for Dortmund for 6 months. And as we mentioned, it's a potential win. I mean, I also think unlikely, but a potential win for United long term if he does find his way back to some sort of form, and he's able to return to Old Trafford, either in a situation where United can sell him onto a club who could afford him and take him on long term, or into a United team under a new coach, under a new sporting structure, now that Ineos are in the building. I don't really agree with I don't really share the skepticism, because I think that's all predicated on the idea that Dortmund would even want him long term, and I just don't think that's a factor.
It could become a factor if it becomes a story. And that's the last thing Dortmund need at the moment.
They simply can't afford him, though, Manu. That's the thing.
No, I know, but like,
even
they
might like the narrative, and they're dealing with a club who deals with narratives and like quite hopeless narratives better than most.
You exist in a sphere where you're fixing another club's problem.
Yeah, perhaps, but
you do have nothing to gain from that. And on top of that, there is a risk that if Sancho does not hit the ground running and, we show some of the same attitude that was criticized at Manchester, then all of a sudden you have another story on top of all the stories that you're already carrying through the season.
But even that does
create some discontent.
That will be limited just to 6 months, and then he'll be out the door again.
Yeah, but you can't be. The point is, you don't have 6 months. You have 6 months to salvage a season because Champions League football is so crucial, right? They're not in the Champions League spot right now. I mean, yes, on paper they are, but you know how fleeting that is. Do we have the guarantee that fifth is enough? Heck, can they even secure fifth the way things are going, right? And I think there is a risk in that. This could cost you money.
Well, as we said, in terms of Champions League, it cost them money, but that won't be anything to do with the Jadon Sancho deal. It's a massive if, Jadon Sancho suddenly miraculously returns to form and has a fantastic 3 or 4 months now with Dortmund and fires him into the Champions League, everyone's happy. If he doesn't, then he'll go back to Manchester either way. Dortmund can't lose from this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, they can, and if it doesn't work, and then as Manu says, they end up finishing 5th or 6th, or I guess 6th in particular.
But that'll have nothing to do with the Sancho deal, will it? That'll be down to Borussia Dortmund.
It could, if it does sow more discontent.
And it does if they feel an obligation to play him week in, week out, and nothing happens. And and this kind of takes me on to the thing that I'm kind of a little baffled by is that, Matt mentioned a moment ago about why things didn't work out for Man United, and he touched on the fact that they already have a number of players in that position when he joined the club. Marcus Rashford's the most obvious one, but God, they had a whole backlog of players there when he joined, Anthony Martial, Greenwood, Juan Mata, even Paul Pogba was playing on the left side, I think, as well at some points. And, you look at that Dortmund team and there's an equal amount of players who'll be vying for that kind of left wing spot or right wing spot. Let's be honest, they can all play the wing either way. And, you've got Julian Brandt, who, has maybe played more central this season, but often gets shoved out wide if Terzic's trying to squeeze everyone in. Marco Reus has been playing a lot more this season as a number 10, of course, but can also play out wide. Daniel Malin, who's been hot and cold. Karim Adeyemi, who's been somewhat far from impressive, to be honest with you, but, a big transfer, big earner at Dortmund, a player who kind of demands consideration week in, week out. And then, of course, the one player who's actually looked quite good so far this season, I've even mentioned Gio Reyna, by the way, but he's there as well, is Jamie Bino-Gittins, who almost exclusively plays in that left wing role. And, if from now until the end of the season, he's sitting on the bench because Dortmund have an obligation to play Jadon Sancho in that left wing, that's just going to cause further frustration. It's going to cause further turmoil between the fans and the club. And it just kind of further breeds this contempt for the sporting project of the club, because it just kind of you just get a sense that nothing is working. And like I said, if there was a long-term plan here, and if Jadon Sancho arrives and the plan is for him to eventually return to the club, and there's some sort of bizarre agreement, then you can understand why Terzic and the board would prioritise Sancho on that left wing week in, week out. But if he's just a loan signing, then where is the actual incentive to actually even play him in the first place? If you've got someone like Bino-Gittins or Daniel Malin or Adeyemi or Gio Reyna or Julian Brandt.
Assets that you own, right?
That's why I think Sancho's a nice bonus to have. Now, we're talking about big ifs and hypotheticals. If Edin Terzic feels an obligation to have to play Jadon Sancho, now I don't believe for a second that there is anything contractual that Sancho has to play. But if Terzic then just feels an obligation to have to play him, then again that's a different issue altogether. That's Edin Terzic's problem. I think if Manny's right, then Sancho can be a potential added bonus. Nothing more. And if at least if I were at Borussia Dortmund in this situation, that's exactly how I would see him. He's absolutely not match fit. He's not played in ages. He's had 2 terrible years. If he can provide 1 or 2 goals, assists, the odd performance here and there, maybe even off the bench, which as part of a greater constellation contributes to Dortmund getting into the Champions League and he leaves again, then okay, great. If it turns out in training that he's clearly not up to speed and doesn't even make the matchday squad for 2 more months, then also so be it. It's not cost him anything, hardly. But yeah, obviously it's going to have to be well managed. But you'd have to presume that Kale, Terzic, Shahin, and Bender have all discussed this and are prepared for that.
Mm.
If not, that's their issue.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing as well is that Terzic has had this kind of unique kind of issue with inside forwards in the squad this season, in the sense that if there's one position that seems to continue to elude him, it does seem to be those kind of wide roles where he hasn't really managed to get a song out of Daniel Malin, out of Adeyemi. Obviously, Gio Reyna had his issues before Terzic arrived, but that hasn't changed. Bino Gittins is probably the only one I can think of that's actually seemed to thrive despite his injuries. So if you actually kind of want to flip it and say, what does Jadon Sancho get out of this move to Dortmund? There's a lot of risks there as well because, he'd probably be looking at a squad thinking if he can't get Daniel Malin or Adeyemi to work this system, why would Jadon Sancho work in it? Obviously, you could argue he's a better player, but tactically and in terms of the formation, there's nothing about what Dortmund have done this season that says they know how to get the best out of inside forwards.
No, there's not. I agree with that. Although one thing that might stand to benefit Sancho is that Edin Terzic does like to do these direct substitutions, direct replacements, where he'll take off a winger, simply replace him with what are effectively fresh legs. That I can imagine would feasibly be a role that Jadon Sancho would play in the final 20 minutes of games if his match fitness was considered up to it. Daniel Malin, at least in the second part of last season, would be an example of a player who arguably did find his best form eventually under Terzic, although there's rumours that even he could be off, which again might be another reason why having at least the option of Jadon Sancho in the squad is a good idea.
All right. Well, I think we need to wrap this up, but here's my final analogy. I think Borussia Dortmund are a mechanic who should be fixing their own cars, but rather than fixing their own cars, they're taking someone else's car fixed up instead while their own cars are still rusting in the driveway, because that's what's going on here. I think of all the assets that they have that they need to get going first, Adeyemi, for example, Malin, etc., and instead they're bringing on someone else's project for free, sure, but also to no gain.